Hello everyone. My name is Matthew Deeprose from the University of Southampton, and today I'm going to be talking about the importance of considering contrast when we use colour, and I'm going to share the approach that I've developed for checking that when we use our brand palette, our institutional brand palette, that our colour choices are accessible. And I'll be inviting you to benefit from this method if you wish. And at the end of this slide deck, I've added lots of further tips and techniques that I've been using over the past year that you might find of use as well. Now, in our current era of increased online delivery, ensuring equitable access to online services and materials is more important than ever. And colour contrast plays an important part of that. In a survey of the top 1 million web pages, 86% were found to have low contrast text, and 44%, almost half of the files uploaded to an LMS or VLE like Blackboard or Moodle, Canvas, have at least one contrast issue. And why that's important, I believe, is explained very well by this quotation from Joe Banks, who is the tech lead at 23andMe. He says that he tends to skip over text that has low contrast because it's too much of a strain to read it. Now, talking of too much of a strain, maybe these examples are too much of a strain for you to read. These are examples of insufficient colour contrast, whereas here, with a subtle change, we now have sufficient contrast. And using this approach is important not only for those who have a visual impairment, but also where so many of us have been working from home and studying at home. We're dealing perhaps with screen glare or inadequate lighting and so on, or devices that just aren't quite so good, or we're just in our environment, they aren't working so well. An example of that is screen glare. Here we have the examples from earlier on the left, where we have insufficient contrast. The screen glare makes that hard to read. And on the right, the screen glare still doesn't help, but hopefully you can see that it's much better when we have sufficient contrast. A simple rule of thumb is that light text on a dark background is easy to read, and dark text on a light background is easy to read. But let's look at these 9 examples in rows of 3. The top row, most would agree, is hard to read, and the bottom row is easy to read. But what about that middle row? For some, that might be easy to read, for some might be hard to read. How do we know when we have sufficient contrast? Well, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have a method, and these guidelines are used by the EN 301549 standard, which is part of the public sector body's accessibility regulations we've been hearing about already. And how we understand about the use of contrast is by determining and then comparing the relative luminance of 2 colours. This methodology is due to be superseded in the next generation of the accessibility guidelines, but for now, this is the current method that we use. Most of us will be using an online colour checker. My favourite is whocanuse.com. You put in 2 colours using their colour codes, and the result that you get is a number. And the higher the number, the better. And the ratio that we should remember when we're presenting text is that we should have a minimum contrast ratio between the colour of the text and the background of 4.5 to 1. So let's look at those examples from the middle of my 9 boxes here. That middle row, all of those examples have a colour contrast rating below 4.5 to 1. So these are colour combinations that we should not use for the presentation of text. And that's fair enough if we are in complete control of our colour choices. But what about if we're using a brand? I'm sure many of you might groan if you hear the phrase, is it on brand? Are we using the brand? Not everyone, of course, needs to use a university brand. But for those that do, there are advantages. It can make things more intuitive because it's more consistent across different services and platforms, therefore reducing cognitive load, which I think all would agree is something we could all benefit from at the moment. And therefore, because of that consistency, can seem more professional and harmonious. And at the University of Southampton, we have a common framework for for online education. One element of that is to connect students to the campus. Some of our students won't have been on campus for the past year. So according to our colleagues, to develop this framework, students that have a clear sense of belonging to an identification with their program and our university are more likely to succeed. And one element of connecting to our campus is using our brand. But how can we make it simpler for colleagues to identify accessible color combinations within our brand? Because most of us just want to be doing a good job, and we want to be concentrating on creating the content without too much extra cognitive load of thinking about making sure things are accessible. And my own experience of this is from when I was updating our Blackboard theme from a new responsive theme that out of the box looks like this, and adjusting it to meet our kind of university brand and making sure that the color choices were accessible. So I was looking up repeatedly our color choices, and over time I decided, well, it would save me a lot of time if I created a lookup table, a matrix. And with 441 combinations in our university brand, it would have taken a long time to produce manually. So I created a script that could output a table like what you see here. And I was explaining it to colleagues like, well, if you have white with white, obviously that's a fail, you can't see it. Whereas we know we have sufficient contrast, where we're at the AA with a minimum of 4.5 to 1 color contrast, or the AAA level, which is 7 to 1. There we can see that in the matrix. In the accessibility guidelines, they also have a classification for if we're only presenting graphics like user interface components, then we can have a slightly lower amount of contrast, 3 to 1, and that's marked by a G. Now, this was set up originally as a PDF file, and many colleagues were printing it out and putting it on their walls who were creating content. But over Christmas, realizing, well, we're all been far away from our offices and our printouts, I've updated my script so that it produces a web-based version, which has the benefit of being responsive. And you also have some interactive elements like being able to filter to only show, for example, the AA or AAA color combinations that we can use. And I was also able to sneak in some details automatically using the script, which have proven to be good conversation starters. Like, did you know that only 19% of the color combinations in our brand are suitable for the presentation of text? I'm sure if we were to revisit our brand or create a new one, we would want to make that higher, wouldn't we? And another bit of feedback I got from our enabling services team was they would like to see what different examples of the accessible color combinations looked like, so they could plan the creation of their materials. So the matrix provides that for them as well. And also options, because it's online, where people could download the data or find out more about color contrast or about accessibility in general, just to have everything there in that one page. A few examples of real world usage. Recently, perhaps like your institutions, our IT department introduced a warning when emails were received from outside the university, and this generated a lot of negative feedback, partly about the choice of color. Although it was accessible, it was a bit in your face, which is what it was designed to do. But the team that created that warning, they contacted me and said, could you explain to us how we could come up with an accessible alternative which was on brand? And together we used the matrix and agreed on this. Another example is our humanities department, or our faculty of humanities. They wanted to have a new course template, and they wanted a consistent course color scheme for every course within each school within the faculty. So all archaeology courses would look a certain way, or English courses and so on. And you can see those examples there. And we used the matrix, showed them the matrix and showed them how to use it so they could come up with choices that suited their purposes, that they liked, but which of course were accessible. And I'm pleased to say that all but one of those were at a AAA level, and only one of them was at the AA level. And having created this script, if you would find this useful, I can feed in your colors. Just send me the details, and I've put the links into the chat here, so you don't need to write anything down. You can look at my page where I set out the kind of information that I would need, and within a week I should get that back to you. So what I've covered today is the importance of considering contrast when we use color, and I've shared my approach and invited you to benefit from it. And I do have some extra materials at the end of this deck that I can go through, if depending on how many questions there are, or you can have a look at them yourselves, or they could be used as part of a future session. So thank you very much, and I will break now for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. That was a great presentation. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting, and thank you so much for sharing the links as well, so allowing other people to kind of benefit from this as well, from your hard work. That's very kind. Do we have any questions in the Q&A, Nick?
Yes, we've got quite a few questions. One of them from Anonymous says, from a previous presentation, which I think was Ben's presentation, it would appear that for accessibility, we should only use a light cream/peach background in order to be accessible to all. Am I mistaken? I like dark backgrounds, but not sure that's accessible to all visually disabled people.
That is a fantastic question, Anonymous, and it's something that we've been talking about a lot as well. And I agree that in general, the kind of the background color that's most often used and thought of as accessible is a cream background with dark text. But just to give you some examples, like if you have photophobia, then the more bright light, the more white there is, the worse it is for you. Whereas if you have astigmatism, which is an eye condition, then when you have a black background with white text, you can get a halo effect. So there will be different combinations that work better for different people. The Web Content Accessibility guidelines don't actually have anything about this in particular. I've got several kind of answers from my point of view. One is that we should avoid a pure white with pure black text or pure black with pure white text. So in my slides, I've got a black which has quite a lot of dark blue within it, and I'm using grey, light grey text. And likewise, if I wanted to have a kind of a lighter background, I might go for something with a bit of cream or vanilla, and with a black text that just had a hint of grey but wasn't like pure black, because when you go to the extremes, that can have quite a negative impact on people. Also, the other option is to have a choice. Now, what I really like about Blackboard Ally is that it can produce, we haven't actually launched this at our university yet, but we will be doing so this year, is you can have alternate versions like an EPUB or a web version. And the great thing, if you use a web version, then you can then use, say, the accessibility toolbar or a plugin to change like the background color or the text color to really suit. So it's kind of concluding, we definitely need to be using accessible color choices, and we should be aware of some of those extremes, like not using white with black is obviously the greatest contrast. I think it's like 21:1, but we could, but being aware that that can be too dazzling for people, and going to those extremes, and also having perhaps a choice if that's available. And as long as you're accessible, then perhaps customizing to your audience at that time, and then revisiting that, say, as your cohorts change and so on. So that's how I see it. But it's also, I think it's something that people could talk about for a very long time. So I'm very interested to hear how any of the other presenters would answer that question.
That's great, thank you. And you actually answered a few questions that came in, which is sort of about using the black text on white backgrounds and high contrast, things like that. So that's really great.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's great, thank you.